Hello everyone. This tutorial is for your scale distortion project where we're using a Photoshop collage technique. You're emphasizing the distortion of scale, the use of value, and space. In this tutorial I'll show you a few techniques, and we will also work on these in class and expand on some of these ideas as well. My background image I'm starting with, because in my image I want a good foreground, middle ground, and background. I've already converted this to grayscale, image, mode, grayscale. My image size, this is 11.5 by 8, and it's a low res image because we're only going to use these on screen. So the file sizes you're working with are 72 pixels per inch, and they're right around 8 by 10 or 8.5 by 11. And you would have already converted the sizes in class. I have a 4-color image of these goldfinches, and I've isolated this goldfinch. And because I know I'm going to enlarge the finch from this picture and place it in another picture, I added a filter to it that I sharpened the pixels that are used in the image so it'll look a little crisper when I copy and paste it. So you'll notice here on screen that this bird looks a little more contrasty because I had sharpened this selection. And to make the selection, you can see the line that's activated around the bird. There are a variety of tools you can use to select one object and isolate it to use on another page. You could use your lasso tool, polygon, or magnetic lasso. We practiced a little bit in class. You could use your direct quick selection tool or magic wand tool. The more contrast you have from the subject you wish to isolate from the photo, the easier it'll be. Your quick selection tool might be a good way to go to get started. You could select the number of pixels in general that it'll grab. 25, 26 might be a good starting point. And you can subtract or add to your selection. That's what's going on in this upper left-hand part of your bar across the top. I'm just going to show you quickly here with this bird, but the bird I've already isolated is the bird I wish to use. I can hold down my mouse or my pen if I'm using a Wacom tablet, and I can quickly select the bird. Now if I zoom in, Command plus, I can take my brush that is subtraction of my selection tool. I could reduce the number of pixels so I have more control, like 9 or 10 pixels. And I could go along the edge of that bird. I'd have to make up that beak a little bit because there's one bird in front of another. I grabbed my plus selection tool because I wanted more of that round edge. Oh, but I have to minus again because I overshot. But you need to experiment and try different things. Different tools will work depending on the kind of image you have, the complexity of it, and a lot of trial and error practice. That is how you'll become faster and more proficient in using the software. So I'm just giving you an example here with the direct selection tool, and perhaps that would work. Now the other thing you would want to do before you copy and paste out of this image is you probably want to refine the edge. And whoops, Command Z, I'm going to say cancel. I didn't want it to isolate everything quite that way, but you could work in that palette and select 1 or 2 pixels to refine that edge. A quicker, easier, simpler way, especially for us as beginners in this particular course, you could just smooth the edges. Okay, so smooth instead of refine edges. Refine edges for much more complicated high-end work. We will do that in our next project. This is just a quick intro project. You could just choose 2 pixels would be great. You just want to soften the edge so you don't have a straight, hard, cut edge kind of look to the image. And that should be fine. So those were a couple of points we did talk about in class. And the reason I'm going over to my history palette is I want to deselect everything I'd drawn on that bird. And I'm going to zoom out because the bird I've already drawn is the bird I want to do Command C for copy. I want to come over to my bird cage and I want to paste my bird in. Now you'll notice because my bird was color and I pasted it into a grayscale file, it converted it. Because our concerns are about distorting the scale, showing space, and adjusting the shadows to emphasize the direction of light. I want to be sensitive to how I'm using value when I'm using grayscale. And I have this window on my left. There's a light coming in through the window. This bird I had chosen because of the highlights on that side of the bird where you see my mouse scrolling. And I just thought it would work to show value and the direction of light. All right, so I have my 2 layers, my background, and this bird could be called my foreground. I'm going to go ahead and name it. I'll just call it bird foreground. If you get in the habit of organizing and naming your layers, the more complicated your files are, the easier it will be to work on the various layers. I'm going to go under Edit, Transform, Scale. I want to make my bird larger and in proportion. I don't want to distort it that way. I want it to be proportional to the correct proportions of the goldfinch. That's the kind of bird this is. So if I hold down my Shift key, grab a corner and pull, the bird grows proportionally, not just vertically or horizontally. And I can double click. Well, he's pretty big. Maybe I might just transform scale, make him just a smidgen small. But in some ways, maybe that makes sense because the bird wouldn't fit in the cage. Oh, I think I'll make him really big. All right, and his claw right there on that rim of the pottery. Oh, that might work fine. I'm going to zoom out just a smidge. Oh yeah, I think that works a little better than what I had in mind to begin with. The reason I'm zooming in is I need my eraser tool. Some of the edges, some of the darker green from the background that contained the bird is still present. I'm adjusting up here to my upper left the hardness or edge of my eraser. I don't want my eraser hard edged because I want to create a softer edge that looks more natural for a transition. So hardness 25%, and I'm using a more feathered edge. And the amount of pixels, 24 is probably okay. See, I can judge how big my eraser is going to be. And I want to gently just go along the edge to get rid of a little of that dark green that I see around the edge of that bird. So the bird will look a little more natural. So one technique in Photoshop where you spend a lot of time is definitely cleaning up edges, definitely. I want to be careful. I don't want to erase too much of my bird, but I don't want it to have a dark halo around it. I want to look a little natural, even though it's fairly unnatural, this giant bird that won't fit into that bird cage. And around this edge is where it's most awkward. I'm going to reduce the number of pixels. I want to get right in there and right around these claws and clean them up a little bit. And around that edge. I'm going to do Command Z because I think I grabbed a little too much of it. And I might want a smidge of a shadow there. That's probably fine. And next thing we'll work on are the actual shadows we need. All right, I'm going to zoom out just a smidge. Maybe zoom back in. I'm not sure what that claw, I like the highlight on the claw, I just didn't like the shape of it. There we go. All right, I'm going to make a new layer called shadow. Okay, there we go. The shadow I actually want under the bird, so I'm going to put it, drag it, my layer to be under the bird. All right, because I can bleed the shadow underneath the leg of the bird. I can alter it. It just shouldn't be pasted on top. I'm going to use my paintbrush tool. Oops, wrong one. There we go. My brush tool right here. I've already selected a gray value. We're in grayscale, so all the CMYK numbers doesn't really matter because I'm using only black or gray. So I want a dark gray, and you can see my dark gray color here. So whatever color I have on top here is what my paintbrush will be, which is there. I want the paintbrush to go ahead and have a soft edge. I want few pixels, so I have control. Maybe 14 is a good size. You can kind of see the width there. I think I want just a smidgen smaller. There we go. All right. So I'm going to take my paintbrush. I'm going to think about how the light comes from the left to the right. I'm looking at this bird's leg, and I'm thinking of the curve right here. I'm thinking I need a shadow like that. And I might need a little piece of shadow there, and perhaps right there. I'm trying to create a sense that the bird is holding onto that piece of pottery. And I'm using my opacity so that the shadow might appear a little more natural. I'm going to grab my paintbrush and maybe extend that as a little piece of a curve. And I'm just going to make the shadow a tiny bit darker. All right, so that will help this look a little more convincing. Now, if the light comes from the left across the head or the shoulders here of the bird, perhaps there's a curved type shadow right here. Let's give it a shot. Maybe it's like the head of the bird. I'm just painting it in. I'm thinking about it. If I don't like it, I can just get rid of it. Here, maybe I need it less opaque. I'm going to zoom out just a smidge, double check. Maybe that works. Yeah, that's probably okay. A little bit darker perhaps. All right. Now, there's another shadow I want. New layer. I'm going to call it shadow 2. All right. This particular shadow has to be on top of the bird. Okay, so my bird's in my foreground. I have the shadows I just placed. See how I turned them on and off? You know, the more I look at that, I'm going back to that shadow. I'm going to make it a little less opaque. There we go. Now I'm on shadow 2. I want a little tiny shadow right here. Like the light's coming in from the left side. I just want the head of the bird to move forward a little. I create depth through contrast. So I'm grabbing my brush. I'm going to zoom in just a smidge. And I'm going to paint right here. I'm going to paint a little kind of crescent shape. I'm going to change the opacity to adjust my shadow. Maybe a tiny bit of length to that shadow. Build it up a little there, tiny bit there. Zoom out just a little. And that shadow may be a little less opaque. There we go. And I'm going to zoom in just a hair. I'm going to take my selection tool and I'm going to move my shadow a little more to the edge of my bird. I'm going to grab my paintbrush and just add a piece of paint. There we go. Zoom out. And I think that's good. I have a little piece of shadow there. I have that shadow. I think for the most part, I will call this finished. So I'm going to show you a second file. Yes, it's more birds, and you should recognize this building on campus. It's the same Goldfinch again, except what makes this file different is that it's in color. And I want to walk you through some of the ideas and these layers that I created, and I'm going to turn things off so I can explain it to you, because these are the things I want you to think about as you build your file. You might have an image that shows a great deal of space. We talked about perspective, we talked about depth, we talked about atmospheric perspective, linear perspective. Here I have a great sense of space. All right, I'm on the quad, I'm looking at Big Grapes Hall. I have these people, I get a sense of scale and proportion, everything looks natural. Then if I add my Goldfinch, the bird begins to distort the scale. This giant bird on the microwave tower, the small people, it's as if this bird's looking down on those people. Tasty morsels. The sunlight's kind of overhead. You do see the shadow here coming right to left. I understand the light on this bird's a little backwards, but it's up sky is where the sun is, and I'm going to change that shadow. All right, I have the shadow of the Goldfinch. If you look right here, the shadow, so you get the idea the sun's in the sky. See where my mouse is moving and shining down, and here's a little bit of a light shadow. Remember, I'm going to delete that shadow because it's clear that it moves left to right and there's a darkness here. But it could hit and have a piece of shadow there. Without the shadow on the top of the building, it doesn't look as convincing. Now, I added Cardinal in the foreground. He's rather large. He's peeping out of the rose bushes, but now he just looks stuck on. If you look at this Cardinal, yeah, I can copy and paste images, but I want to control the image to make it convincing, even though I'm distorting the scale and creating something that looks more fantastical. I need a shadow on that Cardinal. So I added a shadow to the right. See how I'm turning it on and off here in the right? I also need a little more shadow on the body of the Cardinal. And I added shadow underneath the Cardinal's tail. It's like the sun's up here in the sky, shining down on that Cardinal, shining down on this Goldfinch. Remember, I haven't forgotten. I'm going to tell you how I'm going to fix that. And now I don't like this rose bush area, so what I did is I copied and pasted a little piece of the rose bush. I cloned it out. See that little tiny rose? I just used my lasso tool. I grabbed it, I copied, I pasted it, I erased some of the edges, and I put that little rose there. All right. So that's how I built this particular image. I thought about the direction of the light and the scale of the birds to the people to the whole environment. Now, if I zoom in and explain to you how would I correct that shadow that doesn't really match my two birds. I'm on the background. This is my background layer. This tool right here is your clone tool. Looks like a big rubber stamp. What I'm going to do is choose just a few pixels, probably 5 or 6, okay? And I have to hold down my Option key and click and select an area like I did on my roof. So when I selected part of the gray of the roof and clicked my mouse, I can clone some of the gray roof to that edge and zoom out. So I eliminated the shadow across the top. I don't necessarily mind the shadow on the side of the building. I just didn't like that dark shadow that really dominated this left to right kind of idea. My final image I converted to grayscale, as you can see here. When you convert to grayscale, when you're working in full color like you see here, if I go image mode grayscale, it's going to ask me, do I want to flatten my image? I'm telling you now, you always want to do a save as file, and you always want to save all your layers, because if you want to go back and edit the file and you flatten it, you've lost all that information and you can't get back to those individual layers to correct them. So I'm saying don't flatten, or I'm just going to cancel because I'm going to keep this file. I made a save as file and I renamed it Bib Graves Black and White, and this file is flattened. Everything's on my background layer. These shadows I made on the Cardinal, I can't adjust them in this file. This file's different because I added a second bird and I added this shadow here. I'm going to zoom in again because on this flattened file that's in grayscale, see how the shadow's still there on Bib Graves? I'm going to grab my clone tool, Option, click, and I'm just cloning in some gray. It'll help just make this illusion slightly more convincing. And I just want the dark pixels away, and I'm going to zoom out. All right. Now, one thing I don't like about this composition is all my negative space. I have a lot of empty sky. I'm going to just grab my selection tool. And I don't think I need this left-hand side over here. I have these rulers along the edges, and I can grab a guideline, and I can just add one where I think I wish to crop it. I can pull one from the other side. I don't think I need any of that rose bush in the foreground. I think the composition will be stronger by eliminating this needless left-hand side and some of that sky. My crop tool's right here. I can pull these corners into that area. All right, so now notice these grids that are there. Remember the rule of thirds we talked about? Up here in my top bar, I have different views that help me determine composition. Remember, we have to think of our composition anytime we do anything two-dimensionally. Where do we place objects and why? So if I keep the rule of thirds turned on, it's showing me those points of power within the composition. And if I think of this cardinal in the foreground, perhaps that's what I want closest to this lower point of power. Okay? This bird's up there in the sky. He's farther back. I have a little more asymmetrical kind of compositional balance because I have the width of the sidewalk acting as this triangle going back to a vanishing point. It really emphasizes the perspective scene. All right, so I'm explaining to you in this video not just Photoshop techniques, but the logic behind my decisions into cropping this image to make a stronger composition. This is a little more interesting. This bird becomes more of your focal point, although your eye does follow into this doorway. So for now, this is all I want to show you and discuss in this video, and we'll work more on this in class.